Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this week's lesson is on um, the early civilizations of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is located in what is basically modern-day Iraq, um, the land generally located in and around the region of the Tigris and Euphrates River. And Mesopotamia was the birthplace of Sumerian civilization, and Sumerian civilization is often regarded as the first true civilization. So, Mesopotamia, it refers to the area around the Tigris and Euphrates River. It's part of a broader area known as the Fertile Crescent. The Tigris and Euphrates, they flow down from modern Turkey down through what is modern day Iraq, and then they end in the Persian Gulf. And it was here in Mesopotamia that we see the emergence of perhaps the first civilization in human history, known as the Sumerians. And the Sumerians were a culture of people that made up a collective group of city-states here in the southern portion of Mesopotamia. The worldview of the Sumerians was very much shaped, and the religion was very much shaped by the environment and by geography. This area received very little rainfall. They use irrigation. They have to live near the rivers to sustain themselves, and they create reservoirs, and they farm and they grow barley and wheat and peas very successfully. But the environment of Mesopotamia is very unpredictable, and it shapes the worldview. It shapes the outlook of the Sumerians. The Sumerians were centered down in the orange. The Sumerians did not form an empire per se. If you see on the orange, the Tigris and Euphrates down towards the mouth of the Persian Gulf, they did not form a true empire. Rather, their civilization was a collection of semi-autonomous city-states that interacted with one another, but were not held under a single controlling empire. There were a dozen cities, and they had a population collectively of around about 100,000. Sumerian cities were centers of politics, where the kings lived, where political affairs occurred, religious affairs occurred there, military affairs. They built huge walls to protect their cities. They were also economic centers. The Sumerians, their worldview is very much shaped by the reality around them. So the reality around them geographically is very open. And so, meaning that there are no real geographical barriers to protect them from outside raiders. So they have to build walls around their cities. Unlike Egypt, which you see here in this map as well, the Egyptians were very fortunate. They had natural barriers. To the west, they had the massive Sahara Desert, and to the east, they had the Red Sea, and of course, the desert of the Sinai. And so, and of course, to the south, where you found Sudan, at the time known as Nubia, the southern area was really protected by a series of cataracts or waterfalls that made it very difficult for an outside group to come and attack Egypt. Well, Sumeria wasn't like this. Sumeria is very open, and so the geography was rather open, and they faced constant invasion from those seeking to plunder the wealth of their cities. Agricultural civilizations, as we talked about last week, are the first civilizations to really develop individual wealth, to develop the ability to store agricultural goods, the ability to store food supplies, the ability to make tools and weaponry and so forth in large quantities. And all of these would have attracted raiders seeking to capitalize on this stored wealth. When we look at Sumerian religion, we see a very interesting lesson when it comes to the development of early organized religions. And if you were to compare Sumerian religion with the Egyptian religion, you would find that they're very different. Sumerian religion, like Egyptian religion, was polytheistic, meaning that both worshipped multiple gods. The gods were usually associated with the environment. This you're looking at an artistic depiction of the ziggurat at Ur, to the moon god. Ziggurats are not the same as pyramids. Ziggurats are temples um, where religious sacrifice and worship occurs. They are not the exact same as pyramids. They are not built of the same materials. These are built of like a clay style brick. Um, Sumerians had a very negative view of the afterlife. And if you compared it to the Egyptians, you would find the Egyptians had a very positive view of the afterlife. Um, the Egyptians mummified their people. They built pyramids to act as a vessel for the movement of god kings into the next realm of existence. And Sumerians don't see life like this. Sumerians have actually a very negative view of the afterlife. Generally, Sumerians believe that there was no afterlife. There was no eternal life for man. That the afterlife was something that could only be participated in or had by gods. People weren't gods, and so they could not achieve eternal life. Um, so the Sumerians have a very negative view of the afterlife, and herein lies a question about the early development of religion. Why is it that Egypt would have such a positive view of the afterlife, while the Sumerians possessed such a negative view of the afterlife? Some variations, took the form of that a person was forced to eat sand for 9 days, which is hardly the afterlife that any human would like. Why do you think the Sumerians possessed such a negative view of the afterlife? The reason relates to the realities of the environment. The environment which did not provide protection for raiders, unpredictable flooding. The Tigris and Euphrates are not like Egypt's Nile. The Nile River used to flood very predictably. The coming floods at the seasons were something that the Egyptians followed and knew like a clock almost. Tigris and Euphrates rivers come down from the high mountains in Turkey, and they were notorious for flash flooding, for changing their courses, and that resulted in devastation to the people. And for the people, when these types of things occur, it only means one thing, and that is the anger of the gods. So the environment, constant raiders, unpredictable flooding, leads the Sumerians to develop a more pessimistic view of the afterlife and of life in general. This is the ziggurat, the temple to the moon god at Ur, modern day. This is located relatively close to Baghdad, Iraq, and the Sumerians are highly influential on the development of other Western religions, particularly Judaism, and through Judaism, Christianity, and also Islam over the long term. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the first known human sort of epic story. It is sort of like the way you might think of the Odyssey for the Greeks. The Epic of Gilgamesh was a story about human struggle, a human journey. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the primary character goes on a quest. He's seeking eternal life, ultimately, in part of this quest. And there's a great flood in the story. In the quest for eternal life, the primary character of the story finds he has to dive to the bottom of the river, and he has to get this piece of river weed, and this weed would hold the key to eternal life in his quest for eternal life. And as he gets it, and he thinks he's achieved it, and as he does, a serpent comes up and seizes it from him. And this was all an example of the futility of man's quest for eternal life. The story conveyed the notion that eternal life was for the gods, and that it was futile for man to seek it. In these stories as well, you find the origin of the Noah and the Ark story from the Bible. The great flood story from the Bible was influenced almost certainly from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Abraham, the patriarch of Judaism, came from the area of Sumeria. He originally came from the city-state of Ur, which is where this ziggurat is from, and he migrated from Ur to Cana. And so as a result of that, it's very logical that Abraham would bring with him certain components of Sumerian culture and Sumerian religion that would influence his worldview and his thinking in another place, in another time. And this influence is seen in the carryover of the great flood story of Noah and the Ark. Of course, flood stories are often very common in ancient civilizations, and that is often because ancient civilizations lived near rivers, and rivers like the Indus River or the Tigris and Euphrates. These rivers oftentimes would flood unpredictably and sometimes catastrophically, and that led to mythological flood stories. Abraham would also be influenced by the Babylonians and Hammurabi's Law, which is the first known human law code, which was deeply influential on the development of Jewish law, of Hebrew law. So the Sumerians have a different type of religion when compared to the Egyptians. They are polytheistic. Their polytheistic view, their negative view of the afterlife, has a lot to do with the fact that they faced a very repressive environment. They faced raiders with regularity who came to plunder their cities, and they faced unpredictable floods that destroyed civilizations in seemingly the blink of an eye. These were all believed to be from the will of God, and they shaped a more negative view of eternal life and the afterlife than was had by their counterpart at the time, the Egyptians. The Sumerians were also, of course, massively significant civilization, not only for the religious influence that we just talked about, but also for building. They were masters of early engineering and early building. They used clay bricks, but also, of course, early written language. And here you see a cuneiform tablet. The cuneiform written language was a wedge-shaped language. It's considered the earliest known human language, dating back to as early as 4000 BCE. And we have recovered quite a lot of cuneiform tablets. And they would have used the cuneiform for law codes, for writing epic stories, for keeping tax records, and so forth. They also were associated with the advent of the wheel around about 3500 BCE, which revolutionized, of course, the movement of goods and, of course, the construction of monuments and temples. Sumeria fell in around about 2370 to an empire known as the Akkadian Empire. And if you look on your map, you'll see Akkad located slightly to the north of Sumeria. The Akkadians founded an empire. So when we say they established an empire, and in the blue you see Sumerian in the sort of orangish, and then the greenish turquoise color is all the Sumerian Empire, the Akkadian Empire, which lasts for a relatively significant period of time, and its leader was Sargon the Great, or Sargon the First. So take a second and think about, what is empire? When we say they formed an empire, what do we mean by that? That's a very important term in history, because empires have a tremendous amount of influence on the development of humanity. So let's take a second and think about, how would you define empire? Generally, empire can be defined as a large area, a large group of populations, of diverse populations, that are brought under the control by a singular outside power. So empires create large network spheres, meaning that empires bring under control many different peoples, many different cultures, different religions, different political structures, and they bring it under the control of a singular outside power. Empires are often dictatorships, but they do not have to be, or a monarchy. They don't have to be monarchical. Most historians would accept that at least at some point in the 20th century, the United States was an empire, if it's not still an empire today, which many historians contend. Empires, though, connect people from far off areas, and they facilitate trade, they facilitate the movement of ideas. They also can be very, and generally are often very repressive, and they're also often brought about by military control, military conquest, and they often are very repressive of the other people that they control. And that varies depending on the empire we're looking at. We're going to be looking at a number of different empires in this class, and it's important to understand what we're talking about when we say empire. Um, Empires are large, expansive units that are controlled by a singular center, that bring under control many different people. And they can facilitate the movement of goods, the movement of ideas, the movement of peoples, of trade, of economics, and so forth. But they can also be very, very repressive of the individuals that are under the conquest of an empire. Sargon I conquered Sumeria around about 2370, and he created a major empire in the Fertile Crescent. This was a very significant moment. It's the beginning of a period in which major empires in the ancient world will vie for control of this very important region, important for growing agriculture. It's important for trade. It will be the center of Alexander's empire in some respects. Of course, Egypt was very much the center of Alexander's empire too. But of course, Alexander died in Babylon, in Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamia was very much the focal point of the Persian Empire, of the Akkadian Empire, of the Assyrian Empire, of Alexander's empire, and so forth. Following Sargon I, the old Babylonians, led by or founded by more or less Hammurabi, controlled the region. Now there's other kingdoms between the Akkadian kingdom of Sargon and the old Babylonians. We don't have time to necessarily talk about them all. I mean, you have kingdoms like the kingdom of III, for example, which we're not going to talk about. But I wanted to mention Hammurabi, the old Babylonians. These are not the Babylonians that you would associate with your reading from the Bible, if you're aware of like the King Nebuchadnezzar and the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those were the Chaldeans, known as the Neo-Babylonians, and they were over 1,000 years. Their period of dominance was over 1,000 years after the old Babylonians of Hammurabi. Hammurabi became associated with the first formally written and codified legal system. Hammurabi's law, highly influential in the development of world civilizations, particularly in the West. Hammurabi's law was a law code designed to create a legal justice system for the people in the Babylonian Empire. And this was highly influential on the Hebrew people. The Hebrew people borrowed from the old Babylonians ideas of Hammurabi's law code. And so this was a highly influential and significant development. The law code was based on very harsh punishment. It's oftentimes associated with the concept of an eye for an eye. But it was not an equal law code. Everybody did not get treated the same way. And just in the same way that today you might look at your law code in the United States today and say that because of the abilities of a wealthy person to have the best representation in the legal system, that wealthy people generally get a certain different kind of justice than a poor person who might get a court-appointed lawyer, for example. It was rather similar with Hammurabi's law. Punishment was different for wealthy. If you were wealthy, you could pay a fine for many crimes. If you were poor, you would get the harshest of harsh punishments that could result in the amputation of a hand or in your death. Robbing a poor person robbing a wealthy person would almost certainly be punishable by death. So it's a harsh law code, but it is not evenly. The punishment is not evenly distributed to those of different classes in the society. So the last slide I want to mention, and we're jumping a little bit ahead in terms of chronology here, but the last slide that I wanted to mention was the arrival of Indo-Europeans in Mesopotamia. The Indo-Europeans are a massively significant group of people. They are a broad group of people. It is a language family, and the various languages, there's many languages that are associated with the Indo-European groups: Celtic, Greek, Germanic, Anatolian, which is an extinct language. Anatolia is the area of modern Turkey. We can also refer to that area as Asia Minor. Some of the Indo-European groups are groups like the Aryans, who of course migrate to particularly the Indus River area of northern India and Pakistan, what is northern India and Pakistan today. The Aryan migrations to the Indus River Valley create the roots of the development of modern Hinduism as they come to the Indus River area with their various belief systems, and they interact and they intermingle with the group that was already there, known as the Dravidians. The Mycenaeans, the Greeks, were influenced by Indo-Europeans. Groups in Italy, like the Sabines, who would be important in the development of Rome, were influenced by Indo-Europeans. Indo-Europeans are very significant because of their expansive migrations and their influences on other peoples, and influence in respect to the development of religions, but also in terms of technology. Indo-Europeans are associated with the development of iron technology. They're associated with the domestication of animals and horses, particularly the advent of the development of war chariots, which revolutionizes the way that the peoples of places like Egypt and Mesopotamia, for example, made war and established empires. The Indo-European group that conquers the Babylonians in 1595 was known as the Hittites. And the Hittites' greatest leader was Suppiluliuma, and they were associated with bringing war chariots, domesticated animals, iron weapons, and so forth into the region, and kind of creating a new era in the ancient world with respect to technology and how things were done with respect to military things, but also in respect to building technology. It's important to remember that all of the great pyramids of Egypt were built without beasts of burden. Those were before the arrival of domesticated animals, which came after those influenced by the Indo-Europeans came. And this influence extended into Egypt through a group known as the Hyksos, and brought to Egypt new military technology, as is depicted in the horse and chariot above, and also new logistic technologies in terms of using horses for communication, for building, for movement, and so forth. So this was a revolutionary development that in many, many ways shapes the languages that are spoken places. It shapes the religion that are spoken places. It shaped the religion that was practiced in places, and also it shaped the technology that was adhered to in certain places as well. So the Indo-Europeans were very, very significant people, and we're going to talk more about them as we move forward in the class. These individuals that migrated from Eurasia and ultimately moved to different areas and shaped the culture, shaped the development of religion, changed technology and the technologies of war and so forth in these regions. So highly, highly significant group of people that has a long-term lasting effect on much of the ancient world. Okay, guys, I hope this is helpful, and let's have a great week.